The sun had only just begun its descent, casting a golden haze over Rome when you first stepped into the Subura. It was the kind of district that people spoke of in hushed tones, unless they were drunk, in which case they shouted its name with laughter and slurred curses. Subura was a place where senators sent their slaves in secret, and patricians disguised themselves in worn cloaks, hiding their rings. The air smelled of roasted chestnuts, donkey dung, and desperation. Vendors shouted over each other, peddling everything from garum-stained fish to stale love potions. But you weren't here for potions. You were here for something much darker. As you walked past a crumbling arch, daubed with graffiti, some filthy, some pitiful, some strange, you felt the weight of every watchful eye. This was no place for tourists. This was Rome's shadow, and it was swallowing you whole. A gaggle of boys, no older than 12, darted past you, one of them brushing your tunic and then vanishing into a side alley. You patted your coin pouch, still there, but barely. That was Sebra's first lesson. Always assume you're being watched, touched, judged. You passed a butcher's stall, where a man in a blood-soaked apron was skinning a goat with expert flicks. Behind him, an older woman leaned against a phallic statue, laughing as she pressed her breasts into a soldier's armored chest. He didn't resist. No one here did. Just beyond them, a narrow passage sloped downward, its walls coated in chalky drawings of men and women, gods and monsters, all tangled in positions you couldn't quite make sense of. This was your road, now the alley that led to the Lupanar. The entrance was nothing like what you'd imagined. There were no flashing signs, no open arms, just a small, crooked doorway set into a crumbling wall with a terracotta oil lamp flickering above it. Next to the door, someone had scrawled a Latin phrase in charcoal. Quisques, amat, perdit. Whoever loves, loses. You ducked inside, and for a moment, the world outside vanished. The air was thick with incense and the cloying scent of unwashed bodies, sex, mildew, and old blood. Your eyes took time to adjust. The interior was dim, lit only by wall-mounted lamps and candles that cast long shadows on uneven stone walls. A wooden desk sat just inside, manned by a sallow-faced eunuch with a ledger. He didn't greet you. He didn't look up. He simply extended a bony hand, palm up. "To asses," he said, in a voice like crushed leaves. You dropped the coins. He rang a tiny bell. A door opened at the far end of the hallway, and a girl stepped out. She looked no older than 15, draped in a loose tunic with a neckline that had been deliberately torn. Her hair was oiled and tied back, her lips painted a sickly red. She didn't smile, she didn't speak, she just gestured. Her eyes did not meet yours. You followed, uncertain, your feet brushing straw scattered across the floor to soak up bodily fluids. As you passed doorways, some closed, some open, you glimpsed flashes of movement. A man groaning, a worker vomiting into a bucket, a child curled up, asleep or unconscious. It was impossible to tell. Graffiti covered nearly every surface. Names, insults, warnings. Felix futuit hic. Felix screwed here. Some had dates, some had prices, others had illustrations, crude enough to make your stomach knot. She led you to a room barely larger than a cupboard. There was no bed, only a stone platform with a rough woolen cloth spread over it. A single oil lamp sputtered from a shelf, casting shadows like claw marks. In the corner, a clay jar reeked of urine and spoiled wine. She sat down on the platform, knees together, hands folded. "Name?" you asked, stupidly. She shook her head. You looked closer and noticed a mark just above her left breast burned into the skin. A slave brand, probably Greek. Her collarbone protruded like it wanted to break free. She spoke now, flatly. 3 positions. No violence, no piss, no gods. The rules were not for your protection. They were for hers. The only rules she was allowed to enforce. She watched you, unblinkingly, waiting. You didn't touch her, not yet. Something in your chest had begun to ache, not arousal, not fear, guilt, maybe, or something even older, buried beneath your skin. You sat on the edge of the stone and looked at her. "What's your name?" you whispered. She said nothing. Then, after a long pause, she muttered, "Sylvia." You knew it wasn't real. None of them used their real names. Real names had weight, and weight could get you killed. You tried to speak again, but she cut you off. "Time is paid." Her tone was not cruel, just tired. She reached out and touched your chest, then slowly pushed you back. This was not a seduction. This was procedure, a performance, rehearsed countless times in countless rooms, just like this one. Somewhere down the hall, someone screamed. Not in pleasure, not in pain even. In something else, a primal sound that belonged to neither man nor beast. Sylvia didn't flinch. She reached for the oil jar beside the bed and dabbed her fingers in it, then onto your skin. It was cold and smelled of garlic and herbs. She began to unlace your tunic, methodical and unhurried. Behind her, the shadows on the wall flickered and danced like demons trying to climb free. The sound of flesh against flesh filled the air, dull, rhythmic, indifferent. Outside the door, the eunuch's bell rang again. Another client, another coin, another life devoured. Sylvia leaned in, her breath faintly sour. "Just don't make me bleed," she whispered. You couldn't do it. You stood up, hastily retying your tunic. Sylvia didn't stop you. She simply turned her face to the wall, knees tucked to her chest. You backed out into the hallway, your feet unsure, your stomach roiling. You passed a young boy scrubbing a bloodstain from the floor with vinegar and sand. Past a door left open where a man sat slumped over a girl's body, still breathing, but barely. The stench of iron and vomit hit you in waves. You burst through the entrance and back into Subura. The air outside, somehow worse. The city didn't care. A drunk laughed. A dog barked. A coin changed hands. Above you, storm clouds gathered like gods, holding back their rage. You had thought this would be a story to laugh about, something wild, a night in ancient Rome. But the truth sat heavier than any fantasy. This wasn't entertainment. This was endurance. You hadn't survived a night in the Roman brothel. You'd barely survived 20 minutes, and for them, this was every night, every day, forever. You stumbled back onto the main street like a man spit out by the belly of a beast. The noise of Subura returned, but it felt distant, now muffled, like cotton stuffed in your ears. Your eyes blinked against the oily torchlight. A merchant barked prices in a tongue you barely understood. A passing mule kicked up a clot of mud that splattered your sandals. You didn't care. You walked without direction, driven by instinct alone, desperate to put distance between yourself and what you had just seen. The faces of the crowd blurred together, drunken soldiers, fishwives with cracked lips, boys carrying baskets of figs. Somewhere above, behind closed shutters, someone laughed. It sounded like it came from another world. You ducked into a side alley and slumped against a stone wall, breathing in the sour air of rot and old bread. For the first time, you noticed your hands were shaking. You rubbed your palms against your thighs, as though trying to wipe something invisible away. The image of Sylvia's blank stare wouldn't leave you, her voice flat and resigned. "Just don't make me bleed." The way she turned her face to the wall, retreating inward, disappearing even as she sat beside you. You had expected a show, perhaps a thrill, some grotesque echo of desire. Instead, you had found absence, a hollow so deep it swallowed sound. In the dim light, you saw more of the graffiti etched into the walls around you. Crude sketches, names, boasts. Livia was here. Julius paid to asses. Quintus comes fast. You realized now these weren't jokes. They were attempts at permanent scratches left by men trying to make their visits mean something. But nothing stuck here. Not scent, not sound, not memory. It all got swallowed by the walls, by the oil-stained beds and the endless churn of bodies. You were nothing special. Just another pair of coins. Another name scrawled and forgotten. You had seen one room, one girl, and you were already broken. How many rooms were there? How many girls? A voice called out behind you, hoarse, wet, too familiar. Need another go. It was the eunuch from the door, grinning with yellow teeth. His skin shone with sweat. He held up a key, swinging it from a leather strap. "We got twins tonight," he whispered, then licked his lips. You didn't reply. You just walked away, heart pounding, stomach lurching. You moved through Subura like a ghost, ducking under hanging laundry, stepping over puddles that reeked of human waste. You passed another brothel, marked only by a stone phallus embedded in the wall and a flickering oil lamp. A man staggered out, his tunic soaked with something dark, blood, wine. You didn't want to know. You turned a corner and nearly collided with a group of women clustered around a fire. They weren't prostitutes, not tonight. These were vendors, gossiping, laughing, huddling against the chill. One of them caught your eye and frowned. "You look like you've seen Pluto himself," she said. You opened your mouth to speak, but nothing came out, just a cough. Another turned to her companion and muttered something about another fool from the provinces. You didn't bother to correct her. She wasn't wrong. You were a fool. Worse, you had come here willingly, not for survival, not for coin, for curiosity, for some grotesque thrill. By the time you reached the Tiber, the sky had turned a deep, bruised purple. The river stank, but the air was cooler here. You leaned against the railing and stared at the black water, watching scraps of garbage drift by, orange peels, bits of cloth, a broken sandal. You thought of Sylvia again. Was she finished with her night? Was she still working? Was she still alive? You would never know. Rome didn't offer closure. It offered stories, performances, masks. The truth was buried in silence, beneath layers of stone and smoke, and you had no shovel deep enough to reach it. A voice echoed in your head, "Quisquis amat perdet." Whoever loves, loses. The phrase haunted you now, not because it warned of heartbreak, but because it spoke a deeper truth. In the brothel, there was no love, only transaction. And even those who didn't love, who simply lived, lost all the same. Their bodies, their names, their futures. Love was just one more thing Rome had turned into a weapon, a thing to be bought, sold, corrupted. And yet, Sylvia had given you her name. False or not, it was the closest thing to a gift you had received all night. You stood there until the lamps along the street began to flicker out one by one, until the stars emerged in the polluted sky, faint and cold. Somewhere far behind you, the brothel kept breathing, its heartbeat steady, rhythmic, unchanging. In that place, Time didn't move. Only flesh did. Only coin. Only survival. You turned away from the river and began to walk, unsure of where you were going. One night in a Roman brothel had been enough. You wouldn't survive another. Not in body, not in spirit, not in any way that mattered. And you knew now no one really did. By the time the forum's outer columns loomed ahead of you, the city had begun to stir in that strange half-wakefulness before dawn. The bakers were already sweating over their ovens, slapping dough with muscular forearms, preparing the day's ration of coarse bread. Slaves shuffled down alleys, carrying amphorae, whispering Latin invectives under their breath. You tried to blend in with them, but it was no use. Your tunic was too clean, your gait too erratic, your eyes too wide. You looked like what you were, a man who had looked too deeply into Rome's soul and now couldn't unsee it. A drunk legionnaire bumped into your shoulder, laughed, and muttered, "First night in the city." You didn't answer. You couldn't. Your voice had gone somewhere silent and internal. You wandered into a shaded colonnade near the temple of Castor and Pollux, where the marble steps were still cool from the night air. You sat down, head between your knees, breathing slowly, trying to piece yourself together. There were no wounds, no bruises, no visible marks, and yet you felt flayed. Your mind returned, against your will, to the look in Sylvia's eyes, not pleading, not defiant, but vacant. She had mastered the art of absence. It was the only way to stay whole in a world designed to break you. You wondered how long it took to learn that trick. You wondered how long it would take to forget her. The city would forget her in a heartbeat. Her name, false or not, would vanish beneath 1,000 others. You could already feel her face beginning to blur in your mind. An old man in a frayed toga passed you by, muttering a prayer to Mercury. You barely registered him. What did Mercury care for brothels, for Sylvia, for any of them? The gods were above all this, or perhaps they were part of it. After all, didn't Jupiter himself rape more mortals than he blessed? Weren't half the myths soaked in lust and coercion? Rome's moral code was a curious thing, lecturing on dignity in the Senate, while financing entire districts with the trade of bodies. They built temples to virtue with hands sticky from sin, and no one saw the contradiction. Or worse, they saw it and smiled. You rose and began to walk again, this time with purpose, though you didn't know where it came from. Past the fruit sellers now laying out pomegranates and figs, past a stray dog nosing through the remains of a bar fight. Your body moved like it remembered how to be normal, even as your mind refused. When you finally reached your rented insula 3 floors up, overlooking a courtyard full of shouting vendors, you were numb. The doorman barely looked at you. You climbed the steps on stiff legs and collapsed onto your cot, the straw poking through the fabric, the stink of mold clinging to your skin. You hadn't slept, and yet it felt as if 1,000 years had passed since sunset. You thought about writing it down, documenting what you saw. You reached for your wax tablet and stylus, but your hand hovered there, uncertain. What could you write? I went to a Roman brothel and came back wrong. Who would read it? Who would believe you? And even if they did, what then? The brothel would keep running. Sylvia would keep working. The city would keep laughing, drinking, thrusting, forgetting. You could die in that cot. There was no story to tell, only a wound to carry. That morning, you walked out again, not toward Subura, but the Forum, blending in with toga-clad citizens and slaves in line for grain. You nodded when someone greeted you. You smiled when a girl selling wine jugs flirted. You played the part. But inside, something had shifted. You watched people now, not just their faces, but their silences. How they flinched when touched, how they avoided eye contact with soldiers, how the brothel, though unspoken, echoed in the behavior of everyone. The city wasn't built on virtue, it was built on endurance. Everyone here was surviving something. And you'd survived one night, just barely. You weren't brave, you weren't noble, you'd run. But maybe that was the only sane response. Because, deep down, you understood the truth. Rome didn't care if you survived. Rome didn't need you to. Rome was a city of masks and teeth. And now that you'd seen behind the curtain, you'd never walk it the same way again. Every oil lamp would remind you. Every scrape of sandal on stone. Every whisper in a shadowed alley. You wouldn't survive a night in a Roman brothel. Not because of what was done to you, but because of what you now carried. A piece of someone else's pain. A debt you couldn't repay. And every step forward was a step away from comfort, from ignorance, from the clean illusion of history. Welcome to Rome. Welcome to the truth. The sun rose higher, and with it, the weight of the world seemed to settle deeper into your bones. You walked the city in daylight now, pretending the night before had never happened. The vendors shouted as if the world were still good. Children ran barefoot through narrow lanes. Priests marched in processions, their chants echoing off stone temples. Rome was brilliant in the sun, its marble glinting like armor, its fountains singing with endless water. But to you, it all rang hollow. You could still hear the muffled weeping from behind brothel walls. You could still see the way Sylvia folded into herself, as if shrinking would make her invisible, as if vanishing was safer than being seen. You crossed paths with a group of senators, laughing outside a bathhouse. Their tunics were white as clouds, embroidered with purple lines of status. One of them, the one with rings on every finger, bragged about a new girl he'd discovered in Subura. He used the word like a fisherman describing a catch. Syrian, I think. Eyes like olives, voice like honey. Still fights a bit, but they all do at first. They laughed, you did not. You walked faster, your fists clenched. You weren't surprised. You'd heard that tone before. Men like him didn't think they were doing wrong. They thought they were taking what was owed. They were Rome lawmakers, landowners, orators, and Rome rewarded hunger with flesh. You made your way toward the Aventin, hoping to find quiet among the gardens and lesser shrines. But even here, the whispers followed. A young girl sweeping the steps of a temple had a limp. A slave boy offering incense flinched when a passerby brushed his arm. You wondered if they, too, had been behind brothel doors, or if their fate simply hadn't arrived yet. A priestess smiled at you, serene and distant. She spoke of Vesta's fire, eternal and pure. You wondered how many women lit holy flames by day and suffered torchlight by night. Rome was a place of layers, sanctity on the surface, suffering beneath. You thought about Sylvia again. You had seen her for less than an hour, spoken only a handful of words. Yet she haunted you like a ghost. You didn't even know her real name. You wondered if anyone did. Had she been born in some quiet province, a farmer's daughter? Or was she bred in the back alleys of Antioch, sold before she bled? Did she remember what it meant to be a person? Did she dream of anything at all? You tried to imagine her free walking a hillside, hair loose in the wind, but your mind wouldn't allow it. Every version of her ended in stone walls and flickering lamps. That night, sleep came like an ambush. You dreamed in fragments. Blood on straw, a hand reaching, a voice repeating, "Just don't make me bleed." You woke up with your throat tight and your eyes stinging. Outside, Rome sang its nighttime lullaby drunken songs, distant cries, the soft clink of coin. Somewhere, someone was being bought. Somewhere, someone was forgetting how to cry. You lay awake until the moon dipped below the rooftops, until the darkness thinned and the sky hinted at ash-colored dawn. And even then, sleep wouldn't return, not fully. You had seen too much. The next morning, you considered leaving the city, packing your few things, finding a caravan east or a boat to Sicilia. But what would that change? You weren't the one who was trapped. You were just a witness. You had the privilege to walk away. Sylvia didn't. None of them did. So you stayed. Not out of courage, but because shame held you by the collar. You started noticing things you hadn't before. Which inns served both food and flesh. Which temples accepted offerings from brothel prophets. Which houses had slave girls that never looked you in the eye. Rome wasn't full of secrets. Rome was full of things nobody dared name. You began to talk, quietly, carefully, to others who had visited Subura and come back changed. A baker who left a coin outside a door every week without explanation. A widow who lit a lamp at her window every night for the unseen. You weren't alone. Some people knew, they just didn't speak. Speaking invited danger. The brothels were protected by more than walls. They were part of the economy, part of the structure, part of the myth. To attack them was to question the city itself, and the city did not take kindly to questions. You didn't go back to the Lupena, not physically, but in your mind. You walked those halls every time you closed your eyes. The graffiti whispered from your memory. The stone walls sweated with breath. Sylvia sat in that room, still knees folded, voice flat, soul folded into corners. You carried her with you, not as a fantasy, but as a scar, a reminder that Rome was not marble and laurels. Rome was blood and silence, and beneath its splendor, someone always paid. Time in Rome is slippery measured, not in days, but in market cycles, festival flares, shifts of sun and shadow. You stopped counting how long it had been since that night. A week, 2. The bruising on your conscience hadn't faded. You moved through the city like a man halfway between life and death, neither participant nor protester. Some days you walked the Forum and watched senators lie in polished Latin. Other days you wandered past temples where virgins kept sacred fires burning, untouched and elevated. At only streets away, girls their age lay beneath men who didn't know their names. You started seeing Rome in double, the city above, shining and triumphant, and the city below, rotting, whispering, always hungry. A month later, at the baths, you overheard a conversation that pulled you under again. 2 freedmen merchants, judging by the wine on their breath and the fat on their necks, were talking about a new place near the Circus Maximus. Not a brothel exactly, they said. A theater of pleasures, where girls sang before they served, where men paid extra to see them cry, where the most sought-after performer wore a blindfold the whole time. They say she doesn't speak a word, one said. Just moves like a goddess. You froze. The description struck like a blade. It couldn't be Sylvia. You didn't want it to be, but you knew it was possible. In Rome, novelty was currency, and broken people became products. That night, you stood outside the new establishment. The facade was elegant, no phallic signs, no open gutter smell. Just a pair of torches and a carved plaque reading Domus Voluptas, House of Pleasure. Men in embroidered togas, drifted in and out, laughing, stumbling, tossing coin like grain to pigeons. You stood across the street in shadow, heart thudding. You didn't go in. You couldn't. You weren't sure if it was cowardice or mercy, for her or for yourself, but you watched for hours, until the last customer staggered out and the door closed like a tomb. You walked home feeling like your ribs were filled with lead. From that night forward, Rome changed again. The Subura was no longer a singular den of vice. You realized every district had its version, hidden, elegant, or disguised. A tavern that charged extra for the girl who cleaned the tables. A villa where servants were sold with the wine. A senator's country estate that rotated young bodies between banquets. You saw now how the entire city was stitched with these secret threads, and how many hands tugged at them while pretending to pray. The cruelty wasn't confined to the back alleys. It was everywhere, institutional and intimate. The city didn't just tolerate suffering, it built shrines to it. You began writing, not openly, not in wax or scrolls that could be seized or burned. You scratched notes into broken tiles, hid them in cracks behind walls, pressed them into the clay of old jars buried beneath your insula. Fragments of names, snippets of conversations, symbols only you could decode. You became an archivist of silence, not because you thought it would change anything, but because it was all you could do. Some days it felt like madness, others like prayer. Then one morning, while walking the Appian Way, you saw a familiar figure beneath an olive tree. A girl in a loose robe, hair tied back, arms scabbed with tiny burns. She sat beside a man in a merchant's tunic, staring straight ahead as he spoke animatedly. You couldn't hear the words. You didn't need to. The way she held her body still, compliant, barely breathing, told you everything. It wasn't Sylvia, but it might as well have been. There were thousands like her, tens of thousands. Different faces, same silence. You turned away, sick to your stomach, and knew. Rome did not run on grain or marble. Rome ran on sacrifice. Later that week, you received a message from an acquaintance, one of the few who knew where you had gone that night. The note was short. The girl from Subura is gone. No one knows where. You read it again and again. Gone. What did it mean? Dead. Sold again. Escaped. You imagined her on a ship bound for Gaul, or buried in a shallow grave outside the city walls. Or maybe, just maybe, living somewhere with her real name again. You dared not hope. Hope was dangerous. But still, you lit a small lamp that night and set it in your window, just like the widow had done. One light for one girl. One breath against the dark. Rome continued. It always did. The temples rang with incense and chants. The markets shouted with bargains. The games spilled blood for cheers. But now, as you walked through the city, every face you passed shimmered with a second face behind it, one that bore bruises, or brands, or silence. You saw the ghost of Sylvia in every girl who turned her eyes away, in every boy who walked with shoulders hunched. You didn't speak of it, but you never stopped seeing. And in that seeing, you knew you hadn't survived a night in a Roman brothel. Not really. Part of you had stayed there. Part of you always would. Weeks passed, and with them the crisp edge of horror softened not into forgetfulness, but into a quiet dread you carried like a hidden wound. You walked the city in daylight with the rest of them, nodded at patricians, laughed politely at pleasantries, and kept your meals down. But you had changed. Where others saw amphorae and mosaics, you saw the hands that bled to make them. Where others praised Roman order, you saw the bruises behind the masks. At night, your dreams spiraled inwards. You no longer saw Sylvia's face clearly, but her voice remained. "Don't make me bleed," a whisper, always, always, just before waking. You began to chart a kind of invisible map of Roman atlas of cruelty and silence. You started marking places not by what they sold, but by the lives they consumed. This villa took in girls from Botania that let customers beat the staff for a few extra coins. This bathhouse employed boys who never left after dark. You never told anyone what you were doing. You weren't trying to expose anything. You weren't naive. You knew no senator would fall. No brothel would close. You marked the map because you couldn't let the forgetting happen. Not again. You had to carry it. One afternoon, near the theater of Marcellus, you saw a man being dragged out by 2 guards, blood streaming from his nose. Behind him stood a girl, wrapped in linen, her eyes rimmed red. The crowd murmured. Some laughed. The guards pushed the man into the gutter and left him there. No one asked questions. You didn't either. But you followed the girl discreetly as she disappeared down a narrow alley. She ducked through a doorway marked only with a string of rosemary. Inside was a small space stone bench, 2 stools, a shelf with jars. An old woman sat cross-legged, peeling garlic. A safe house, not official, not protected, but real. A place where the broken went to breathe. You visited it again a week later. Then again, you brought nothing the first time. The second time, you brought dates and clean cloth. The third, a jar of honey and 2 needles. The old woman didn't ask questions. The girls didn't speak much. One was missing 2 fingers. Another had a stitched lip. You didn't ask what had happened to them. They wouldn't have told you. But you swept the floor, replaced burned-out lamps, whispered prayers in your native tongue when you thought no one could hear. You didn't belong there, not really, but you came anyway, because it was the only place in Rome that didn't ask for coin in exchange for presents. One night, a girl pressed a small wooden token into your hand. It was smooth, circular, with a crude image of a woman holding a lamp. "You keep," she said, "for when it gets dark." You carried it everywhere after that, tied it to your belt, then moved it to a pouch, then wore it around your neck, under your tunic. It wasn't magic. It didn't protect you. But it reminded you of the night you didn't survive, and the silence that followed. Rome had given you 1,000 stories. This was the only one that mattered. And yet, you were still a part of the machine. You still bought bread baked by slaves. You still walked roads paved by beaten hands. You still paid taxes that funded the very structures that consumed lives. You knew this. Every act of charity felt like a drop in the ocean. But what else could you do? There was no clean path forward. Only resistance in small ways. A coin slipped to a runaway. A warning whispered to a new arrival. A name remembered when everyone else tried to forget. You began to write again, this time in proper ink, with care, not for publication, for memory. You wrote about Sylvia, not the facts of her life, which you didn't know, but the truth of her presence, her voice, her stillness, her rules. No violence, no piss, no gods. You wrote about the lupanar, about the bell, the graffiti, the shadows. You wrote it all not as confession, but as witness, because you had seen what most of Rome pretended not to. And someone, someday, had to know. Sometimes you wondered what would happen if you returned to the brothel, walked in again, coin in hand, head high. Would anyone recognize you? Would Sylvia be there? Would her voice still be flat, Or would she refuse to speak at all? You never went. The thought alone was enough to twist your stomach. You had crossed that threshold once, and part of you had never come back. That was the truth of places like that. You entered thinking you were the one with power, the one with the coin. But the place had power over you. It redefined you. And Rome never let you forget who you really were. Years later, when the city erupted in fire, you watched from a rooftop as the sky turned red and the gods seemed to rage. People screamed that it was Nero's madness or Jupiter's wrath. But you, quietly, whispered that maybe it was justice. Maybe the city had finally consumed too much. Maybe it was choking on the pain it had ignored. The Lupaner burned too, they said. No one saved the girls. No one ever did. And maybe Sylvia was still inside. Or maybe, just maybe, she'd already found her way out. You never knew. But that night, as ash fell like snow, you pulled the wooden token from under your tunic, pressed it to your lips, and held it there until the wind took it from your hand. The token vanished into the wind like a blessing or a curse. You didn't chase it. You stood there, hands still raised, watching the smoke crawl across the skyline like a living thing. Rome burned, but it did not scream. It whispered. The flames devoured wood, cloth, bone, everything but silence. You could imagine the crackling in the brothel walls, the heat seeping through the painted images of gods and phalluses, melting centuries of carved lust into ash. Maybe Sylvia was there, watching it all end from behind a curtain. Maybe she was already gone, or maybe she had become part of the flame itself, untouchable at last. In the smoke, you imagined her walking barefoot through the ruins, head high, a new name on her lips. In the weeks that followed, Rome groaned like an old man rising from sleep. The ashes cooled, but they didn't settle. New buildings were planned. New brothels opened. Nothing truly changed. The emperor blamed Christians, then foreigners, then no one. Stone was cleaned. Streets were cleared. But beneath the facade, the rot still pulsed. You knew that for every wooden door replaced, a new girl was dragged inside. For every burned ledger, a new list of names was written, this time in finer ink, but with the same cruel breath. Rome did not grieve. It rebuilt. The brothel may have died, but the system lived on. You thought often of leaving then, not fleeing, just stepping out of Rome's dream. There were other cities, Alexandria, Antioch, Massilia, places with different smells, different shadows. You could start fresh, become anonymous again. But then you'd pass another alley where a young boy limped, or hear a scream swallowed by laughter at a feast, and the thought would crumble. You couldn't unknow what you knew. You couldn't unsee Sylvia. Rome had marked you, not with a brand, but with memory. And memory was a chain more powerful than iron. One afternoon, you returned to the sick house. The old woman was gone, died, someone said during the fire. The girls had scattered. One had married a man who sold olives. Another was working in a bathhouse under a new name. You found the lamp, still unlit, and a small clay cup turned upside down on the shelf. Inside was a folded scrap of linen. You unfolded it with shaking hands. No name, just a drawing, a crude image of a woman holding a lamp, and beside her, a bird with its wings open. You didn't understand it then. You only knew that it mattered. You took the cloth with you, wore it tied to your belt. Whenever the city pressed too close, whenever the weight of it threatened to grind you into dust, you touched the fabric, not as a charm, but as a tether, a reminder that someone once tried to fly, that even here, in the mouth of the beast, someone had drawn wings. You began to speak less, listen more. You watched for sin's small rebellions, subtle kindnesses. A woman passing bread through a crack in a wall. A boy smuggling messages in amphory. These were the threads you held on to. Thin, fragile, easily broken, but real. Years passed. You aged in the quiet way of men who carry things. Your hair grayed, your back curved. The city changed its emperors, its statues, its slogans, but the brothels remained. New names, new bodies, same story. You wrote what you could, hid it in jars, in clay tablets. You carved messages beneath benches and into the backs of floor tiles. You knew no one would read them, not now, but maybe someday someone would break the ground open and find your words, and maybe they'd understand. On your final night in Rome, the sky was clear. No fire, no screaming, just the rustle of wind through leaves and the sound of a distant fountain. You sat on the same rooftop where you'd once watched the city burn, the same place where you'd lost the token. You looked down at your hands, older now, spotted with sun and age. They had never healed from that first night, not really, and you were grateful. The pain kept you honest, kept you from becoming like the others. You reached into your pouch and pulled out the cloth, again now worn, the edges fraying. You laid it on the rooftop stone and smoothed it flat. Then you whispered her name, the real one, the one she'd never spoken, but you had dreamed of. A name stitched from silence and shadow, given not by her master or her keeper, but by the witness. You said it like a prayer, and then let the wind carry that too. Somewhere in the city, a lamp flickered. Somewhere else, a girl closed her eyes and imagined a sky without ceilings. You wouldn't survive a night in a Roman brothel. But maybe, just maybe she had, and maybe your remembering had helped her fly. The next morning, you rose before the sun. Your bones ached with the weight of years, but you moved slowly, deliberately, dressing as you once had when you first arrived in Rome, before the scars, before the silence. The streets were quiet, hushed with the cool breath of dawn. A light mist clung to the paving stones, like the city itself was unsure whether to wake. You stepped out of your insula and walked, not with haste, but with the kind of finality that comes when one has already left in the heart, and now the body simply follows. You passed shops with their shutters drawn, temples with their doors half open to catch the first incense, and fountains trickling like whispered prayers. Your feet led you, unbidden, back toward Subura, not the exact spot you had no desire to see ruins or ghosts, but somewhere close. The streets were still stained by what had come before. New plaster on old sin. Even here, gentrification meant nothing. The stink remained, just buried under perfumed cellars and polished porticos. You stood beneath a lintel marked by centuries of fingerprints and saw, tucked between cracks in the wall, the faint outline of a faded carving. A wing, just one. You touched it and remembered the cloth. You remembered the girl who had handed it to you. She had seen your shame and given you something anyway. That had been her defiance, her dignity. You found a bench outside a small bakery and sat. The smell of warm dough filled the air. A bueno, more than 13 tied. He gave a shy nod. You nodded back. Behind his gaze, you saw something familiar. Not fear, but a quiet wariness. As if he too knew that Rome demanded parts of you in trade. He disappeared into the alley, and you watched until he was gone. You wondered if he would survive, if he already knew too much. You hoped selfishly, maybe, that someone would do for him what you had tried to do for Sylvia, to see him. You spent that afternoon by the Tiber. The water was low, the banks muddied, traders loaded baskets onto skiffs. A group of soldiers laughed while throwing rocks at a stray dog. You looked out at the current and wondered what it would carry. Grain, bodies, secrets. Rome didn't care what it transported, only that it moved, that the engine kept running. You sat there for hours, let the sounds wash over you, closed your eyes, and tried to imagine a world where brothels didn't exist, not just the buildings, but the reasons they thrived. Hunger, power, indifference. Could you imagine a Rome where no girl had to learn silence to survive? As twilight fell, you returned home. Your stairs creaked beneath your feet. The oil lamp burned low on the table. The cloth was still there, folded as you'd left it. You sat down and began writing. Not another list, not another record, but a story. A story for those who would come later. A story about a city that called itself eternal, but built its eternity on the backs of those no one remembered. You didn't write Sylvia's name. You didn't have to. You wrote about a girl with quiet eyes and a voice like gravel. And you wrote about a man who thought he was just a visitor, but learned he had always been part of the machine. You finished the story just as night crept in, fully soft and dark. You rolled the parchment, sealed it with wax, and placed it in a clay jar you'd saved for years. You didn't hide it far, just deep enough in the wall that someone rebuilding one day might find it. You left no signature, just the drawing of the lamp and the wing. Then you sat beside the window. You didn't cry, you weren't sad, you were tired, but it was a good tired. The kind that came from finishing something long overdue. The moon rose, silver and full, over the rooftops of Rome. Somewhere in the distance, a lute played a slow, mournful tune. You leaned back and watched the stars. The same stars Sylvia once stared at, maybe through a crack in her stone ceiling. The same stars that watched over every forgotten life. And as your eyes began to close, one thought remained. Not a scream, not a prayer, just this. She was real, she was here, and I remembered. The night deepened, wrapping Rome in a hushed velvet quiet, only found in the hours between fevered indulgence and the first cries of dawn. You didn't sleep. You sat still, facing the open window, letting the moonlight drape your face like a gentle farewell. The streets below were nearly empty. A lone cart rumbled by, wheels groaning against the stone. A cat slinked across the roof opposite yours, vanishing like smoke into shadow. You felt no fear, no guilt, not even peace, just the slow settling of everything you'd carried. A lifetime ago, you had arrived in Rome, wide-eyed and hungry for history. Now you were history, or a fragment of it, a whisper beneath stone. As the candle beside you burned low, your fingers found the groove in the windowsill you'd carved unknowingly over the years, just a nervous tick, the edge worn down by habit. But in that groove were years of watching, listening, becoming. You thought of the girls who had passed through the safe house, the ones who spoke, the ones who never did. You remembered their gestures, their glances, their silences. None of them had survived in the ways stories demanded. There had been no grand escape, no miracle rescue. But some had found something smaller: breath, name, resistance. And that, perhaps, was enough. Somewhere, a rooster cried early, confused. The hour before dawn always played tricks. You rose stiffly, bones slow to follow the will. You dressed once more, not in finery, but in simplicity: clean tunic, sandals, the old cloth tied once around your waist. You took the key from the niche in the wall, the one few ever knew about, and stepped outside for the last time. Rome greeted you not with grandeur but with stillness. A breeze swept through the alley like a sigh. The sky above was beginning to pale, soft streaks of light brushing the horizon. The city's breath hitched, waiting. You walked to the Forum, empty now but for statues and pigeons. The marble felt cold underfoot. You passed the Temple of Saturn, where the pillars stood like guards of a memory long decayed. Here, empires had risen and fallen. Here, names had been shouted into eternity. But here, too, no one had spoken hers, not once. You climbed the Capitoline Hill slowly, past guards nodding off at their posts. From the top, the city stretched below you, stone and soot and story. The brothel you'd once entered no longer stood. The safe house had been turned into a dye shop. Faces changed. Names changed. The hunger did not. You sat on a broken column at the edge of the square. The sun was beginning to rise, gold spilling over rooftops. It struck the bronze of Marcus Aurelius's statue, painting his face in false warmth. You watched, hands in your lap, and felt the sun touch your skin. In that moment, you allowed yourself one fantasy knot of revenge, not of justice, but of return. Sylvia, somewhere green and quiet, eyes closed, no voices shouting orders, no fists demanding obedience, a name of her choosing, a space of her own. You knew it was likely untrue, but even a false dream could be a kind of mercy. Voices began to stir behind you, merchants setting up stalls, guards shuffling into formation. The world continued. Rome would live on, with or without your witness, but beneath it, buried in its foundations, your memory waited. The story you had written, the jars you had hidden, the silent girls you had helped stand. Perhaps someday a boy would stumble on one of those messages. Perhaps a woman would find a symbol carved into brick and ask why. Perhaps that question would be the start of something. You stood. The city yawned around you. As you made your way down the hill, your body moved with weariness, but not defeat. You weren't here to save Rome. That had never been the goal, but you had watched it with open eyes. You had remembered those it tried to erase, and that was your offering, your rebellion. That evening, in a corner of the city, in a tenement with cracked walls and broken shutters, a girl lit a lamp and set it in her window. She didn't know your name. She never would, but someone had once helped her when she couldn't speak. Now she helped another. A ripple, a thread, a flame that passed on quietly. And so the story continued, not with trumpets, but with light. You left Rome at dusk, not by parade or proclamation, but as a shadow slipping between shadows. The road beneath your feet was older than any emperor, worn smooth by sandals, wheels, and blood. You passed the gates unnoticed, just another figure among the traders, freedmen, and pilgrims bound for other cities. Your pack was light. You carried no riches, no titles, no trophies, just your body, a handful of letters, and the cloth with the winged woman now sewn into your tunic's lining. It was not escape you sought, but distance. Rome had given you everything it had: truth, pain, memory. It had taken more than you could name, and now, at last, it let you go. The road wound down through hills, scattered with olive groves and tombs. The countryside smelled of dust and time. At a bend, you paused and looked back. Rome stood on its 7 hills, still immense, still proud, its domes and arches gleaming in the last light, like a city that refused to be humbled. You thought of the temples, the senators, the boys with fruit-stained mouths, and the girls with names burned off their skin. You thought of the brothel, its walls, now dust, but its echo still alive. You thought of Sylvia, and for the first time in years, you smiled, not because you believed she was safe, but because you still carried her voice, a voice the city tried to bury. At the next village, a woman asked where you were headed. You didn't answer at first. Then you said, "East." That was enough. She handed you a cup of water and a fig. No questions, no judgment. You ate quietly. A boy nearby watched you, eyes wide. You handed him a pebble you'd carved in the shape of a bird's wing. He turned it over in his palm as if it were a treasure. Maybe it was. Maybe, like you, he'd keep it longer than reason dictated. A reminder of something not quite understood but deeply felt. A reminder that someone once saw him. Nights on the road were soft. The stars were sharper here, unspoiled by torchlight. The silence was complete, yet not empty. You listened to owls, to your own heartbeat, to the wind pressing through trees like whispered names. In sleep, you dreamed not of brothels or Rome, but of fire giving way to rain. In one dream, Sylvia stood beside a stream, gathering water in her hands. She did not speak, but her gaze was calm, whole. In the dream, you did not weep. You simply sat beside her and watched the water move. When you reached the coast, the sea opened like a final page, blue and wide and endless. A port bustled nearby, with sailors calling out in 10 different tongues. You listened, eyes scanning the horizon, letting the salt sting your lips. You didn't ask where the boats were going. You didn't care. You bought passage on the next one, heading away. As you waited, you sat on a rock and wrote one last letter. It was short, a prayer, perhaps, a witness's vow. You tucked it into a hollow in the cliff wall. Maybe it would be found, maybe it wouldn't, but it was enough to write it. The boat left at dawn. As it pulled away, you did not look back again. Rome would survive without your eyes. It always had. But as the shore faded, you held one hand over your chest, over the place where the cloth lay hidden. And for a moment, the weight you'd carried all these years felt lighter, not gone, but shared. Somewhere out there, in another city, another girl would light a lamp. Another boy would carve a wing into stone. Another story would begin not with violence, but with memory. And that, in the end, was survival. Not escape, not revenge, but remembering what the world tried to make you forget. Holding the light even when it was small, even when it was only for one night. The wind off the sea was soft, but it smelled of iron and salt cleaner than Rome ever had. You stood at the rail of the ship as it cut through the morning waves, watching gulls wheel above the foam. Behind you, the coast was already a blur, fading into blue and memory. Ahead lay nothing you could name. You hadn't asked the captain for the itinerary. You didn't care. Wherever the boat landed, it would not be Rome. That was enough. The city no longer needed your feet to haunt it. You had left something behind in its stones, in its cracks, in its silences. You had buried no body, but you had dug a grave. The crew left you alone. You were not young. You did not laugh or drink. You watched, listened, wrote, sometimes, on scraps, on driftwood, on your own skin. The ink stained your fingers like blood that would never wash away. One sailor asked you once, "Are you a priest?" You shook your head. "Then what are you?" he said. You looked at him and said, "I remember." He didn't ask again. People feared remembering. That was Rome's greatest lesson. It was not violence that made the machine run, but forgetting. Pain was tolerable, but memory that was dangerous. At night you stared at the stars, not because they guided you, but because they watched. They had seen Sylvia. They had seen the others. They had seen you. And in their cold glow, you found something like companionship. The sea had no brothels, no coins, no walls, but it carried voices if you listened. Waves sounded like breath. Gulls cried like lost children. You slept without dreams. Or perhaps the dreams simply softened, lost their teeth. You no longer feared them. They had done their worst. Now they only echoed. You disembarked at a small island porta-place of white stone, slow speech, fig trees, thick with bees. No one knew your name. You walked the town's edges, found a hut abandoned by an old mason, and asked no one for permission. You rebuilt the roof, scrubbed the hearth, planted fennel and thyme. You spoke rarely, but people left bread at your door. Once, a child placed a handful of feathers on your windowsill. You kept them, tied them with a thread, hung them where the sun struck in the afternoon. The light cast shadows like wings. Over time, they began to call you the Quiet One. Some said you had once served in Rome's courts. Others said you were mad, haunted. The children said you talked to ghosts. You let them think what they liked. One girl, dark eyes, fast fingers, asked once why you always carried the same piece of cloth. You said, "Because someone gave it to me when I had nothing else." She nodded. She understood. Children always did, before the forgetting began. Years passed like tides. People were born. People died. The emperor changed, then changed again, and Rome remained, somewhere far off, still roaring, still feeding. You didn't write to it. You didn't speak its name, but you did write. Each night, by lamp or moon, you carved words into thin sheets of bark. Not stories, not sermons, just fragments. The sound of a bell, the smell of wet stone, the phrase, "Just don't make me bleed." You buried them in clay jars, sealed them with wax, and planted them beneath your fennel beds. One winter, your hands began to tremble. Your voice cracked without cause. You sat longer in the sun, slept deeper. One morning, you didn't rise. The children knocked, then came in. You were still seated, the cloth wrapped in your hands. Your eyes were closed, but your face was not sad. It was tired, yes, but not hollow. They buried you under the olive tree by your hut. They did not mark the grave with your name. Instead, they carved a small lamp into the stone, and beside it, a wing. And long after they forgot the man, the image remained. And long after the image faded, someone, someday, digging in the fennel field, would find the jar. They would open it, read the words, pause, and remember. Years passed, the island changed. The hut fell. The tree grew broader, gnarled with age, its roots stretching wide into the earth like fingers seeking stories. Storms came and went. New rulers claimed dominion over lands they did not understand. But the grave under the olive tree remained untouched. People said it was cursed, or sacred. It didn't matter which. Children still placed stones there, or feathers, or scraps of woven cloth. No one remembered who started the ritual, only that it should not be stopped. One day, centuries later, a mason clearing land for a new home struck something solid beneath his spade. He dug slowly, respectfully. At first, it seemed like nothing, a broken vessel, the clay chipped and weather-worn. But inside, wrapped in a scrap of oil-dark cloth, were thin sheets of bark etched with faint lines. Words, names, maybe phrases. The mason couldn't read them, The language had shifted over centuries, as languages do, but the shapes caught the light strangely, like veins of truth. He took them to the village elder, who took them to a scholar, who sent them to a city far across the sea. The writings were studied, debated. Some said they were nonsense. Others believed they were a prayer. A few, quieter voices said it read like memory raw and fractured. The words weren't political. They named no gods. They threatened no kings. And yet they lingered in the minds of those who read them. A few lines were translated. The rest remained lost. But this much was preserved. She told me her name, but not her voice. She said, "Just don't make me bleed." I watched the city forget her, so I did not. The text was catalogued, the jar placed in a museum on a shelf between relics of war and empire. Most passed it by without pause, just a broken pot, a scrap of cloth, some bark. But now and then someone would stop, look closer, read the fragment aloud, and for a moment the air would shift soft, weighted, as if someone had walked into the room behind them, as if a lamp had been lit just out of sight. And outside, in the garden near the gallery steps, an olive tree grew. No one had planted it, but there it was, broad-lived and slow-growing. In spring, it dropped feathers with its blossoms. In time, the scholars gave the artifact a name. They called it the memory of the wing and the lamp. And though no statue was raised, no empire trembled, no religion formed, she had been remembered. Not by Rome, not by history, but by those who needed to. And in that remembering, she lived. In the hush of archives and the sterile glow of museum lights, she lived not as a myth, not as a saint, but as a murmur between lines, as the breath left behind by someone whose name had been erased and then whispered back into being. Visitors passed the case without noticing, but a few those who lingered, who tilted their heads, who pressed their hands to the glass without knowing why, felt her, not clearly, not with certainty, but like a scent remembered from childhood, like the end of a dream you didn't want to wake from. Among them was a young researcher, a woman with ink-stained fingers and a habit of walking too slowly. She read the lines over and over, then wrote them down in her own hand. She didn't know what they meant at first, but they felt like truth. She dug into records, into ruins, into the spaces between empires, where names once bloomed like wildflowers and were trampled. Her colleagues called it a side project. She called it honoring. In dusty cellars, she found accounts of slave auctions near the Tiber. In Pompeian ruins, she found a second lamp, etched with the same winged figure. The pattern repeated not often, but just enough. A symbol too quiet for propaganda, too persistent to be coincidence. The researcher published a paper, then another, not on brothels, not on Rome's power, but on absence, on the architecture of forgetting. She quoted the bark fragment. She spoke of the silence behind the stone. And some listened. A few even responded. One sculptor carved the winged lamp into a wall in Athens. A teacher in Carthage read the fragment to her students every spring. A poet in Marseille wrote an entire collection titled "Don't Make Me Bleed." Slowly, quietly, the symbol took root. It began appearing where no one expected it. A pendant worn by a girl leaving a shelter, a mural in the corner of a women's clinic, a graffiti tag on the wall of a city where sex was still bought and survival was still bartered. It wasn't loud, it wasn't branded, but it was there, passed like a secret, carried like a relic, a reminder not just of her, but of all those like her, the forgotten, the used, the ones whose stories were erased, and who, somehow, left behind more than any emperor. The museum eventually moved the artifact to a quieter space, not because it wasn't important, but because too many visitors had started to pause, to cry, to stay. Curators liked to control the flow of emotion, and this fragment defied it. It didn't explain, it didn't teach, it only remembered, and memory left unchecked could disrupt, could demand, could illuminate too much. But the light spread, quietly. In time, a small garden was planted outside the museum gates. Olive trees, fennel, thyme, no plaque, no monument, just a bench with a carving, a lamp, a wing. Below it, the words, "She lived." And one day, a girl sat on that bench, reading a letter she'd found tucked into a second-hand book. The letter spoke of Rome, of silence, of a man who remembered a name no one else did. The girl folded the letter carefully, placed it in her pocket, and stood. And as she walked away, she whispered the words out loud. "Just don't make me bleed." And for a moment, the air around her changed, softened, deepened. And somewhere in the wind, that night, the girl wrote the phrase on the inside of her wrist with ink. Temporary, she thought, just a private gesture. But when she woke the next morning, she found her hand tracing it again. The words had followed her into sleep, their rhythm anchoring her dreams. She didn't know who the woman was, not really, only fragments, a brothel, a voice, a warning. But the shape of her story echoed something in her, something older than memory. She began reading, not just the paper, but the footnotes, the side references, the glossed over citations buried beneath academic caution. In time, she pieced together more than she expected, a symbol that had drifted across generations, like pollen, impossible to pin down, but too consistent to ignore. She wasn't a scholar. She wasn't trying to write a book. She was just a girl who knew what it meant to be silenced, who understood what it meant to survive something people didn't want to hear about. The wing and lamp were not symbols of comfort. They were tools, markers. She started drawing them on lampposts in cities she passed through, on bathroom stalls, on notes tucked into books in libraries. One day, she scrawled them on the wall of a police station, beneath a poster celebrating Roman justice. No one saw her. She made sure of that. But the next day, someone added to it. Not a wing, not a lamp, just a name, Sylvia. And now the story was no longer hers, alone. It grew not like fire, like roots, quiet, winding, patient. Other hands carried it forwards, sometimes unknowingly. A tattoo in Glasgow, a mural in Mexico City, a lyric in a protest song in Tehran. None of it said her full name. None of it had to. She had become more than a girl in a brothel. She had become what Rome could not contain, a memory that refused to be buried, a story without an ending. A voice that kept reshaping itself in every tongue. The girl who had found the letter never stopped writing, not for fame, not for clarity, but because the writing itself was part of the ritual. She didn't tell the whole story. She couldn't. No one could. But she left pieces at train stations, on napkins, folded into flowers at memorials. And always she signed the same way. A light left on. It spread even further, until the symbol no longer belonged to the past. It became a quiet resistance, an emblem carved into school desks, drawn on the palms of survivors before courtrooms, embroidered into the linings of coats, passed down through families. Some people knew where it came from, others didn't. It didn't matter. What mattered was that it carried weight, it carried warning, it carried her. Eventually, the museum placed the bark fragments and the cloth together in a sealed case with a single word etched into the glass: witness. No date, no culture assigned, just that. On the day the exhibit reopened, a woman stood before it for hours. She didn't speak. She wore no name tag, no press badge. She just stared. And when she finally stepped away, she left behind a small object on the edge of the display, a flat stone painted white. On it, a wing, and beside it, a single drop of red. No one moved it. No one dared. In a world full of noise and spectacle, it was the quiet things, the remembered things that endured. And somewhere, in the hush between cities, between centuries, a girl closed her eyes and whispered, "I am not forgotten." And the lamp stayed lit. Time, as always, moved forward. Cities changed their names. Borders shifted. Technology bloomed and withered and bloomed again. The world wrapped itself in screens and noise. But still, the wing and lamp surfaced in corners, on bodies, in whispers. Not mass-produced, not owned. It refused to be monetized. It refused to die. Academics still debated its origin. Was it religious, feminist, subversive? But the truth resisted pinning, because the truth wasn't data. It was felt, like a chill in the bones before a memory, like a lamp flickering in a room with no electricity. At a school in a coastal village, a teacher asked her students to draw what they feared and what they hoped. Most drew storms, war, loneliness. One girl, maybe 11 years old, drew a wing, a flame, and a girl's eyes wide and quiet. When the teacher asked about it, she only said, "It's for someone who got out." The teacher didn't press, she just nodded. That night, the girl lit a candle in her window. She didn't know why. She'd seen it in a dream. Or maybe her grandmother had told her once. Or maybe the story had reached her another way, curling through time like smoke, looking for lungs. In another city, in another decade, a sculptor found himself chiseling the same motif again and again. Wing, lamp, flame onto doors, benches, bridges. He said he didn't know where it came from, only that it asked to be made. He dreamed of stone corridors and bells ringing, of a voice without emotion saying, "No gods, no piss, no violence." The words meant nothing to him, but the echo stayed. He never sold those pieces. He gave them away, left them unmarked. And in every one, he carved a small groove beneath the flame just deep enough to fit a fingertip. Then, one day, a child in a war zone found a crumpled poster in the rubble of a library. On it, faded but legible, the phrase, "Just don't make me bleed." The child didn't speak the language, didn't know the history, but she tore the phrase off the page and kept it in her pocket for weeks. Folded it again and again until it softened into fabric, until it felt like something sacred. When asked what it meant, she said it was a spell, a protection, a name she would not forget. And in the far future centuries beyond our reckoning, Earth is studied by new eyes, and ruins are sifted from sediment. Someone will find a shard of bark sealed in ancient wax. The script will be strange, but a pattern will emerge. Wing, lamp, flame, somewhere deep in the algorithms of their translation engines. A voice will be synthesized, not digital, but human. It will say, "She lived," and those who hear it will pause, not because they know her, but because they feel her. Because across time, across empire, across forgetting, something remained. Not her name, not her face, but her refusal to vanish. And even then, even on a world no longer called Rome, the lamp will still be burning. The fragment will travel again, this time not by sea or foot or whispered story, but across stars, scanned, studied, stored in data clouds orbiting moons. It will be uploaded into the archives of exoanthropologists cataloging the lost cultures of old Earth. Most of the world's noise will be long gone. The declarations of emperors, the decrees of tyrants, the triumphal arches, and the screams of conquest faded, erased, corrupted beyond recovery. But the voice that said, "Just don't make me bleed," will remain. Not because it was louder, but because it refused to be silenced. In one such archive, a curious researcher, genderless, in this new era, born of ice mining colonies and microgravity, will fixate on the pattern, the wing and the lamp, the flame. It shows up in disparate records, in carvings, in scanned tattoos, in abandoned way stations on 3 continents. No clear lineage, no imperial insignia, just persistence. They will trace it back to a cluster of ruins, catalogued as Romerbahn Complex 17B, a city long since drowned by sea and time. The records will call it unremarkable, but the symbol will call them back. A mission will be dispatched. On the ocean floor where Rome once stood, machines will delicately unearth a crypt, not grand, just stone, just a bench, and behind it, etched faintly into a submerged wall, the wing and the lamp, preserved in pressure and salt. Below it, a single phrase. The discovery will ripple across academic networks, not for its grandeur, but for its defiance. It will prompt a new question, one not of conquest or architecture or battle strategy, but of witness. Who were the ones never named? Who were the ones the empires built upon? Who carried memory like a torch, even as they were ground underfoot? Institutions will try to take hold of it, give it context, ownership, curriculum, but it won't stay still. Already, artists across the scattered colonies are beginning to etch the wing and lamp into synthetic clay. Children hum lullabies that reference a girl with no voice and a man who remembered. No one knows where it started. That is its power. It belongs to everyone. One day, aboard a generation ship drifting between systems, a child will ask, "What does the lamp mean?" And their parent, looking out at the void beyond, will say, "It means someone made it through the dark." The child will nod, not fully understanding, not yet, but years later, when the ship encounters silence or danger or cruelty cloaked in custom, the child now grown will carve that wing and lamp into the wall of their quarters, not for protection, not for hope, for memory, because the lamp is still lit, because the story did not end with Rome, because the whisper became a flame. And in every time, in every place, someone still carries it forward. Far from Earth, in a quiet corridor of a ship, 2 centuries into its voyage, the lamp is painted in red on a panel beside the infirmary, small, almost imperceptible, but always there. The crew has long forgotten who placed it there first. Maybe it was a medic who once treated those hurt in silence. Maybe it was a mother who had no words left after a miscarriage. Or maybe it was someone who never told their story aloud, only left behind a mark so others might know. You are not alone here, and so it stayed. Through rotations, through births and deaths, through repairs and hull shifts, the paint remained untouched. On another vessel, deeper still, into the unknown, a ceremony unfolds. A girl barely 12 cycles old chooses her own name, as is tradition. She places her hand on a piece of blackened iron passed down through generations. Its origin is unknown, but carved into it are the faint traces of a lamp and a wing. She presses her fingers there, then whispers her name, not to the captain, not to the crew, but to the object itself, as if it were listening, as if it could remember. And maybe it does. Maybe that's why every child born on that ship is told the same bedtime tale of a girl who endured the darkness so that others would never forget the shape of light. Back in the ruins of Earth, overgrown and half reclaimed by soil and sea, a drone mapping vegetation patterns stumbles upon a crumbling amphora. It's intact enough to be lifted, scanned. The contents are unremarkable: dust, fibers, sediment, but etched on its surface, in a language no longer spoken, are lines so precise that the drone's AI pauses. It captures the inscription: she lived, she was not owned, she was not erased. The message, once flagged, is added to the growing archive of anomalies fragments that don't fit narratives of glory, conquest, civilization, fragments that whisper instead of shout. Centuries later, on a newly terraformed moon under a foreign sun, a small library is built into the rock face. It contains no indexes, no assigned disciplines, only objects gathered from across the centuries: the iron plate, the bark sheets, the cloth, a replica of the winged mural. No plaque explains them. No voiceover guides the visitor. Instead, the room is silent. At the center, a low table holds a simple oil lamp, not lit by electricity, but real flame, maintained daily, passed between caretakers whose names are never logged, whose only vow is this: keep the flame. One evening, a traveler arrives. Their boots are caked in dust from worlds no cartographer has named. They kneel before the lamp and remain there for hours. When they finally rise, they leave behind something of their own: a small stone, warm from their palm, painted with a single phrase in their native dialect. The translation, once submitted to the archive, is noted and approved by the curators. It reads, "We carry it because she could not." Still later, when the curators gather to record the object's succession, they say nothing. Instead, one reaches forward and places the new stone in a niche carved alongside hundreds of others. Then they extinguish the flame, not in mourning, not in defeat, but in ritual. And as the last wisp of smoke curls toward the ceiling, another curator, wordless smiling, strikes the flint and lights it again. Because the lamp must always be lit by hand. Because silence must be chosen to be broken. Because even in the deepest dark between stars, there must be something that remembers what was endured. And always, somewhere, someone is saying it again, not in Latin, not in Greek, not in any dead or dominant tongue, but in whatever voice the fire understands. She lived, she was seen, she is still seen, and the flame answers, "I know," outside that stone library, in the oxygen-thin twilight of a world far from the sun that first warmed humanity. A child walks with her guardian across the dust-hushed plain. She asks about the building. "What's in there?" The guardian smiles, echoes. The child frowns. Of what? A pause. Then of someone who survived what should have destroyed her. The child stares at the jagged silhouette of the library, glowing dimly with the pulse of its hidden flame. "Did she fight?" she asks. The guardian thinks, not with a sword, with memory. That night, the child draws a wing into the condensation of her bunk window. She doesn't know why, she just does. The library keeps no records of visitors, no biometric logs, no AI interface. It doesn't speak unless spoken to. It listens. That is its entire purpose. Over time, people leave more than offerings. They begin leaving questions, not shouted into the void, but whispered near the flame. Was she afraid? Did she hate them? Did she ever get out? No answers come from the flame, but sometimes the one asking leaves with their shoulders straighter, their breaths steadier, as though the silence itself had spoken a kind of truth. And then, one cycle, a group of archivists discover something new. It comes not from Earth, not from any settled colony, but from deep space, an unmapped ship, transmitting only a series of pulses. No voice, no code, just a pattern. Long, short, long, a pause. Then again, when analyzed, it matches an old Earth symbol, long thought to be decorative. It is the rhythm of oil dripping in a bronze lamp. Slow, patient, persistent. The archivists go still. They realize the signal has been pulsing out for years, decades, perhaps across radiation and debris fields, past nebulae and ice rings. Someone out there remembers, and they are sending the flame forward. When a response is finally sensible, quiet, composed of only light and rhythm, it carries not words, but the familiar pattern carved again and again across time. A wing, a lamp, a flame. The reply is acknowledged, then silence. But now the silence feels shared. Soon after, colonies across systems begin replicating the signal, not for communication, for continuity. They assign it no name, no ownership. They call it the driftlight, a thing passed on like breath between lives. Pilots begin carving the symbol into the undersides of their ships. Prisoners etch it onto cell walls. Survivors wear it beneath their armor. Children sing its rhythm without being taught. The universe expands. Borders shift again. Languages splinter into dazzling chaos. Time itself is kept differently now. But always, there is one place, one wordless pulse of fire that tells the truth. Not all of us were forgotten. Not all of us vanished into history's mouth. Some of us left light behind. And though empires rise and digitize and fracture and vanish, though stars collapse and maps are rewritten, though even Earth becomes nothing but myth and bone, the lamp stays lit, the wing stays drawn, and somewhere in every generation, someone still says, "She lived," and someone still answers, "I know." And long after even the oldest human memories fade after, Earth's dust drifts into stars, and the last of its languages dissolve into pattern and frequency, the flame still survives. Not in fire anymore, not in clay or cloth, but in something deeper, encoded in the decision trees of machines built not to dominate, but to remember. Long-range archival satellites, drifting lightless between galaxies, still carry the pulse, not as a message, as a presence, a constant rhythm among stars to longs, a short, a pause, the lamp's heartbeat. The signal is faint now, not because it is weak, but because it is humble, like breath, like a whisper, like the rustle of straw in a room lit by oil and silence. In time, the beings who find it are not human. They are not even born of carbon. They do not speak in vowels. They do not dream, but they understand pattern. They understand silence. And in that silence, they recognize the signature of suffering endured, not to win, but to persist. They come upon the driftlight with curiosity, then reverence. They trace the signal back through time, layer by layer, until they find the name, scrawled in every form, across every epic, not in syllables, but in shape, a wing, a lamp, a flame. They do not know the story, but they know its weight. They replicate the symbol, not on monuments, but in the structure of how they store memory. Every loss, every moment preserved, is now sealed beneath the symbol. They begin all remembrances with it, not because they were told to, but because it feels right, because they feel, for the first time, that some things must be held with care. And when they encounter other civilizations, metallic, gaseous, glimmering beings with minds beyond shape or heat, they offer the symbol first, before any code or claim, and it is always returned. Because across the breadth of a universe without map or center, one idea has spread, quiet and indelible. To witness is sacred, to endure is divine, to remember without glory, without rewards, how justice survives time. And somewhere, further still, on a lonely moon beneath a black sun, a group of children gather in a shallow stone circle. They are not human, but they are shaped by memory. They sit, forming the lamp and the wing in sand, passing a low hum between them, a Roman room that started in a Roman room carved in shadow. They do not know the name Sylvia. They do not know Latin or Rome or even Earth, but they know this: someone lived who was meant to be forgotten. Someone lived who carried pain like fire. Someone lived and was seen. And as they scatter, leaving the shape behind in the sand, the wind begins to rise. It does not erase the marks, not this time, not ever. The wind carries the sand gently across the moon's surface, swirling through the carved grooves of the wing and lamp. But it does not fill them. The lines remain, somehow protected not by glass or code or command, but by something older, intention. The children who made the symbol do not return. They don't need to. The ritual is not in the visiting, but in the leaving. The space is sacred because they made it so. And long after they've gone, others will come, not out of tradition, not out of duty, but because something in them will pull them here, the way memory pulls, even when names have long since scattered. One day, a traveler from a distant world, a planet wrapped in clouds and silence, will stumble upon the symbol by accident. Their ship damaged, their instruments failing. They land near the stone circle. They walk out onto the moon's surface, exhausted, helmeted, blinking against starlight, and they see it. The carving, the form, something about it stops them cold. They kneel not because they understand, but because their body insists. And then, though they know no prayer, no hymn, they press their palm into the center of the flame and close their eyes. And in the stillness, they remember someone, not a name, not a face, just a voice, soft and steady, saying, "Don't make me bleed." And the traveler weeps. The tears don't fall not in the suit, not in the gravity, but they feel them like gravity in the soul. When they return to their ship, they don't record the coordinates. They don't tell command, but before departing, they place a token beside the carving, a piece of whole, scarred, marked, on it, the symbol etched by their own shaking hand. As centuries pass, the stone circle becomes a beacon not for rescue, but for those seeking something they don't have words for. Pilgrims come without knowing why. Some leave offerings, others simply sit. No doctrine is written, no law governs the place, but all who arrive understand. This is where the forgotten are not lost. This is where the ones who carried silence can rest. Eventually, the stars change. Entire constellations collapse and reform. The map of the universe redraws itself 1,000 times. The materials of life shift from carbon to light to thought, but the memory endures, not in history books, not in archives, but in the way beings reach for each other in the dark, in the way pain is recognized and not turned away from, in the way someone always leaves a lamp burning, just in case. And when, in some future yet unwritten, a new form of life stumbles upon the last remains of the human story, ashes and shadows, fragments and echoes. They will find this, above all else, a wing, a lamp, a flame, and beside it, not inscribed in any tongue, but pulsing through every silence, the only truth that ever mattered: she lived. And the universe will answer, across every galaxy, in every shape of being, with one final, eternal reply: we remember.